And welcome to today's webinar, everyone. I'm going to hand it off to William Gill, today's moderator.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm William Gill. I'm ACRO's Director of Government Relations, and it's a pleasure to have all of you. When I say all of you, that means almost 500 individuals with us today for today's webinar presentation titled National Student Loan Data System Enrollment Reporting. Before I get started, I'd like to add a quick note about logistics. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the session. Please type your questions strictly in the Q&A chat box, and we will read them out loud for presenters to address at the end of the webinar. To provide some context of why we are hosting this webinar, in late March, ACRO, the National Student Clearinghouse, and NAFSA met with federal student aid staff at the Department of Education to discuss the nearly 1,000 institutions who are out of compliance in their NSLDS enrollment reporting. At this meeting, ACRO offered to host a free webinar where institutions could ask questions of the department, especially in light of the fact that the department was getting ready to send letters to institutions who had failed to meet the 90% mark in terms of percentage of students on their NSLDS rosters with certified program information. Subsequently, these first round of letters have been sent to institutions. While it's unclear exactly why so many schools are out of compliance, some of the reasons that we have heard include outdated records appearing on rosters, students appearing on the rosters who are non-degree seeking with no program information, confusion surrounding how students enrolled at more than one institution should be reported, the institution's failure to report program information, and the institution not correcting enrollment roster errors. We really hope this webinar will assist to answer any questions institutions have on how to be in compliance and prevent future letters to institutions. So to help us here today, we have Jeff Baker, Director of Policy Liaison and Implementation Staff at the U.S. Department of Education, Randy Bauman, Information Technology Specialist, Business Operations at U.S. Department of Education, and George Livethi, Vice President, Compliance and Education Finance Industry Relations at the National Student Clearinghouse. In order to just get right into the presentation, I am not going to go through the actual agenda, and I'll just turn this over to Jeff.
Thank you, William, and special thanks to ACRO for agreeing to host this, not agreeing, for volunteering and suggesting that they host this webinar with our colleagues. Most of the time in federal student aid, we're of course working with financial aid administrators, but we know how important it is for our programs that registrars and other officers on campuses be involved in the administration of our federal student aid program. So thanks to Mike and to William and the whole staff here at ACRO. So the next slide, if you would, William, and then move to the next one. We just want to very quickly remind folks of the importance of reporting enrollment to the National Student Loan Data System so that we can use those data for a number of purposes, which we're going to describe briefly in a moment. The screen you're looking at now tells you why it's important for you to report correctly, properly, and timely. You have to maintain for your students who receive federal student loans either at your school or at a previous institution. It's important that we know their enrollment so we can keep them in an in-school status so they don't move into repayment, or where they should, that they move out of in-school status to a grace period and ultimately into repayment. By doing that, we hopefully will prevent loan delinquency and defaults on these borrowers, whether they were your students or not. And as I think many of you know, default rates, we don't want to have anyone default, but excuse me, default rates do affect an institution and an institution's eligibility to participate in the federal student aid programs. So we want to avoid all of that. Next slide, if you would, please. We also provide information to a number of entities, including the Congress, about the students who are receiving federal student aid, in some cases the students who are not, about their receipt of aid, and in direct response to this webinar and the enrollment reporting to NSLDS about whether these students completed their program, maintained or retained the program, withdrew from the program. And we make that information publicly available.
Quick, we see that folks are posting questions in the general chat. We'd like to ask you guys to please put your questions in the Q&A chat box, and try not to be institution specific, but more general. Sorry about that.
No, that's very good. Thank you. We do post this information publicly, and so, to be frank, and, we want to have transparent discussion with you folks today. I don't think you want inaccurate, incomplete, and misinformation being made available to government agencies, policymakers, advocacy groups, and the public. Next slide, if you would, please. Another thing that's kind of like a byproduct of this is proper reporting to NSLDS of students' enrollment will minimize dramatically, maybe even eliminate the need for you as registrars and your staff to deal with paper deferment request forms submitted by the borrowers. So that's a lot easier for the borrowers and certainly for the institutions. And then finally, in terms of campus level, the next slide, if you would, we want to remind you that another reason for having it accurate, timely, and complete is that NSLDS does allow the student themselves, with the proper credentials, to log in and look at their own information. They can look at their own loan information, but for these purposes, look at their enrollment information. And I don't think any of us want a situation where the student is, for example, enrolled at your institution as a full-time student during this period of time, whatever, and they look at NSLDS and it does not have that enrollment reported. That will raise some concern by the students and calls and burden for us and for folks on your campus. So there's some important, and very quickly went through reasons for campus level reporting. We've had campus level reporting requirements for going on 30 years now. The next slide talks about, and William mentioned it, starting in 2014, we began, we're requiring schools to provide program level information. So not only is the student enrolled at your school, full-time, three-quarter time, half-time, whatever, but what academic program are they in, defined as the zip code, the credential level, and the length of the program. That was supposed to be in place by October 1st, 2014, and as William mentioned, and it's just the fact, we have 1,000 or so schools that do not appear to be in compliance with that, and frankly, we've waited long enough. We need this information very specifically for a statutorily required change to the Higher Education Act that we call the 150% direct subsidized loan limit. We're not going to get into detail of that here. Of course, you can check with your financial aid administrators, but that's one statutorily required reason. But we also use it for determine whether students, as part of that, lose their subsidy on subsidized loans. Again, without getting into detail, it's very important because that law was written related to programs the student was in, not just institutions that they're enrolled in. The last two bullets say it can harm your students in a couple of directions if those data are not reported accurately, timely, and completely. I know we're going fast, but we want to make sure we have time for questions. This is a slide. I may not be able to see all the little bubbles there, but this is to show at least some, it's not even all of them, of the purposes or uses that we use enrollment data from our loan servicing. I mentioned about in-school and so on. Our college scorecard, which is also public information that is available about your institution, so you don't want bad information out there. And then the other kinds of things that you can see around the circle there. The next slide, just to graphically show some of the government offices that we share your enrollment information with. And again, you don't want to be on the wrong side of some of these outfits. The next slide is more specific. We're going to talk about the reporting requirements. Before we do that, I just want to make sure everyone understands that many institutions use third-party servicers to do all or some of the activities related to the administration of our federal student aid programs, and certainly enrollment reporting to NSLDS is a totally legitimate activity that can be done through a third-party servicer agreement with another entity. In this case, Georgia's here by the National Student Clearinghouse, because a lot of schools have chosen to use them. But there are others who do this reporting, and there's certainly other third-party servicers that do other work related to our federal programs. But our regulations are pretty clear, and we want to remind everybody that the school needs to be knowledgeable about the financial aid processes, in this particular case about enrollment reporting, and not just defer it all to the third-party servicer. Now, a little bit of details is a different story, but in general, you shouldn't be surprised about this webinar and the things we're going to be talking about. The school is responsible under the regulations and the contract to ensure that their third-party servicer is in compliance with all of the requirements. And if it comes to it, we will contact the schools, not the third-party servicer, if we have some concerns about compliance. And ultimately, there could be a liability against the institution and a third-party servicer. But not just the third-party servicer. So we're really comfortable with most of our third-party servicers, the clearinghouse and others, about the job they do, but this is important that schools understand that it's all back on the institution. The institution is the one that has the agreement with the Department of Education. Okay, so specifically on reporting requirements, under the rules, you have to report to NSLDS. You have to respond to a roster that we send to the school or to the school's third-party servicer if directed by the school within every 2 months. The regulation specifically says every 60 days. We are not counting, which months have 31 or 32 days. Apparently, July and August each have 31. If you do this, say, at the beginning or of each month, the first of the month, third of the month, or whatever, we're not going to beat you up because there's 62 days in that period. But we're serious about every 2 months because we need to have current information. As most systems have, we have an error process when we receive a roster from the school or from a third-party servicer on behalf of the school. We run it through a series of edits. And when there are errors, we issue and deliver back to either the institution or the third-party servicer an error report. Those errors need to be resolved within 15 days and sent back through again. That's very, very important. I'm sorry. The errors must correct within 10 days of receipt of the error acknowledgement file. Even though you may have chosen to use a third-party servicer, the institution can request that the error report come directly to the school. And George, I believe the clearinghouse has a provision where the school could ask you guys to send it.
Yes, Jeff, that's correct. And you have on the NSLDS an interface for schools to go in and make corrections, and the clearinghouse has an interface as well for our participating schools to come in and view their errors and submit updates.
Right. So reporting is important, on time is important, and dealing with errors, however, those get taken care of. Okay? All right. Next slide, again, a little graphical representation of how this process works. The little blue box, if it shows that way on your screen, is we create here at the Department of Education an enrollment roster. We'll talk about who's on it in just a second. We send that on a schedule selected by the institution, but no less frequently than every 2 months. We send that to the institution or to their servicer. The school or the servicer updates that roster, including adding students, and we'll talk about who might need to be added. Sends the roster, I'm down to 6 o'clock now, sends the roster back to NSLDS. And just to be totally redundant, everything we're talking about here, when I talk about the school, under the conditions of third-party servicer, a third-party servicer can do this on behalf of the school. Have to do it correctly and on time, but they can do it. Once we get the updated roster, at 8 o'clock here, we run it and send the acknowledgement report with any errors to the institution, which has the 10 days to make the corrections and send those back up to 12 o'clock at NSLDS. And then we will update our records, and so the next time we create a file, roughly two months from when we first did it, and depending how this flow goes, maybe 40, 50 days after we get the error report, we'll send out the next roster, and the cycle continues. Okay. George has taken the next slide to explain a little bit more how it works if you are a school that uses the National Student Clearinghouse to handle this.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff. It's a very similar looking slide, but we at the clearinghouse, for all of the schools that participate with us, we establish a schedule with the NSLDS for the enrollment rosters to be created every month for all of the schools that participate with us. We also discourage our schools from going in online with the NSLDS and modifying that schedule. We feel that that schedule is important for maintaining compliance and the timely reporting of enrollment information to the NSLDS and then onward to loan servicers. But typically around the second or third business day of every month, we get a file for all of the rosters for the schools that participate with the clearinghouse. We then, maybe 5 days later or so, we will take the most recently loaded information that's in our database for each school and respond to the enrollment rosters with that most recently certified information. So That's why if you're a clearinghouse school, we do a pre-check on your data, and if we identify any issues, we need you to resolve those as timely as possible, because your information is not available to anyone, and it's not available to be put on the response to an NSLDS enrollment roster until you resolve those issues and we've loaded your data to the system. Then a few business days after we submit your data to the NSLDS, we get an acknowledgement file back, or we get an error file back if there are errors that the NSLDS identifies, and we then present those errors in a list to our participating schools via our secure website. We send you an email notification that the list is there, and schools can go in, they can review their errors. We give you guidance for how to correct your error. You submit that updated information to us, and then we load that into our system, and then we respond back usually around day 8, since the deadline is day 10, to respond to that error file. Usually around day 8 is the deadline that we're sending data to the NSLDS in response to those errors. And so that's the way the process works for us. So back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, George. Clearly the clearinghouse is following the same flow, but there's a couple of steps where they have to get information from the school and send information to the school, particularly on the correction. So if we have some questions on that towards the end, we can consider some questions you have. So now I want to go to the next slide, which students to report. And actually what's not on here is the first really fundamental thing. Any student who's on the roster that we send to you or your third-party servicer needs to be responded to. With the students' enrollment status, if they're enrolled, and there's a whole set of things about effective date and all of that. If they're full-time, three-quarter time, half-time, less than half-time, if graduated, withdrawn, and there's other codes for haven't heard, I don't know who this student is, or haven't seen this student in 10 years. There are codes for everyone, and so every record has to have a response. In addition, those students are generally the people who we have records receive federal student aid, that we call that Title IV aid, at your institution. So our records show that they got a direct loan or even a FFEL loan back when that program was still going on, Pell Grants or any of our other programs. Students are added by other schools because they know that a student transferred to your school. Our federal student loan servicers keep track, and they will, if they get a request for deferment, for example, because the student claims they're attending a certain school, we will add that to the roster so that you can confirm that as it goes on. The student also can go into NSLDS and indicate that she's attending XYZ school, and we'll put it on that roster to get confirmation. We also have in our NSLDS 2 systems we use, we make available, it's not required, for schools: transfer student monitoring and financial aid history. And those are, roughly speaking, where the schools list students in a separate file, send them to us so we can provide information about the historical record of the receipt of federal student aid. But those students, in many cases, then end up on your rosters. So there's a lot of reasons. Most of them are that the student received aid at your institution, or it was reported that they received aid at another institution prior, but they're at your institution now. The next slide is, who should you add to the roster? If you know that you have a student who received federal student aid but at your school and they're not on the roster, except for a little timing issue, that should not happen very often, but we'd like you to add that student. Remember, this is all about protecting the student and having proper information. The second bullet here talks about students who receive federal student aid at another institution. They're not on your roster. You know that they received aid at another institution. You should add them to your roster for the same kind of protection. We are not asking that you go through and every student at your institution to check who's not on the roster, to check somehow to see if they got aid someplace else. But if you're aware of it, you should add them to the roster. And George, the Clearinghouse has a process for your schools to kind of make that more efficient. Is that right?
That's right, Jeff. We have a process we worked out with getting some authorization from you and your policy folks at FSA to be able to look back at previous rosters that we've processed from the NSLDS for our institutions
and compare that to the enrollment data that schools are sending to us. And if we find a student is enrolled at an institution and they previously appeared on an institution's roster or any institution's roster, we notify the NSLDS to add them to that institution's roster in the future. And that's functionality we put back in place back in 2015, and I think it's been working great to resolve a lot of the deferment issues that were out there.
Yeah, it does. And any schools that are not using National Student Clearinghouse, again, you're not required to, but if you know of a student who's not on your roster but received data at another school, add them to the roster, and then we'll be able to put them on, you'll report enrollment, and we can keep the student current in terms of particularly his or her loan eligibility. Okay. Next slide. A little bit hard to read, but this is just repeating mostly what we've just looked at about who ends up on the rosters and how we roll it through. You put the code of your enrollment code, the status on the loan records, on the disbursement records when your financial aid officers or business officers submit records to our disbursement system. That's how we get them and move them into NSLDS. We also get the information from our lenders and loan servicers, and we put them on your roster, okay? As well as the ones that you're going to add, or the ones that came into NSLDS from another school or from the student, him or herself. Okay, move to which programs to report. So now we're in the program stuff here, and we have to talk about the fact that you have a student, they're on your roster, or you put them on the roster. You have to talk about what we call campus-level enrollment. But now you have to talk about what academic program that they're in. And even if the student did not receive federal student aid, you have to report the program that they're in. And this is the thing we're monitoring, and in a couple of minutes we're going to talk about these compliance letters, and we don't want to keep sending bad letters to your institution, so we want to advise you about that. If the student was admitted to your institution for the purpose of receiving a degree or other credential, a certificate or whatever, they must be reported in a program. So you report them in enrollment, whatever they are at the institution, but what program are they in? Because by definition, if they're in a program leading to a degree or other credential, they're in a program. And it has a particular classification instructional program code, a credential level, and a length of the program. Those have to be reported for every student. We've had the question over the last few years about what about students that are undeclared or don't have majors or so on. They still are in a program. They have to be in a program or else they can't receive federal student aid. And so what we have longstanding policy is you decide what program they're in. They could be something we just put general studies, liberal studies, whatever. But it can't just be undeclared because there's no zip code for undeclared. So there has to be, every student has to have a code. A zip code and the other credential information.
Just let me just jump in. For an undeclared major, there is a zip code that corresponds to general studies.
General studies, right. So you use that or liberal studies. Well, this is one of the big mistakes we have, that students are not reported by the school in a program because they don't have a major. You don't want to say they're in chemistry, they're not in chemistry yet. But they are in something, and general studies or liberal studies or something like that. Okay? Next slide. There's other kinds of programs that we want you to report the program in, even though they're not in a technical program leading to a degree or certificate, because it protects the student in terms of their loans, moving in and out of repayment and staying out of delinquency and default and so on. There are teacher certification programs that many of your institutions offer where you do not offer a certificate or a degree in teacher, but the student is taking coursework that allows the student to, when he or she completes, to apply for a teaching credential in your state or in a state. Those students are in programs, and there's program codes for those. You need to report those. Preparatory coursework. There's rules in our federal student aid system about students being eligible for federal student aid, even though they're taking coursework preparatory for admission into a bachelor's degree program or a graduate degree program. What you report there is the program the student is preparing to enter. And then we also have a provision about coursework that does not lead to any credential, but it's fully transferable to a bachelor's degree program. you put in that program that the student is going to be enrolled in. Okay, so we need program information in almost all cases. We have a couple of exceptions we're going to talk about in a minute, but in almost all cases. And even where you think, well, he's not in a program, he's just taking this preparatory coursework, it's the program he's preparing to enter. Okay? There are a couple of exceptions. Students who are only taking continuing education courses or extended education or whatever we call them these days, we want them reported at the campus level, because if we allow them, we've stretched the rules a little bit, and we allow them to get the protection of not moving into repayment. But there is no program. They're just taking a couple of courses to get their upgrade in their teaching license or any number of things in continuing education. But this is where there is no certificate or other credential awarded by the institution. It's just coursework. That's an example where you do not report any enrollment information. And there's a little indicator that if that happens, that you tell us no, so we know you know what you're doing, and we won't hold that against you. Okay? All right. This slide, I'm not going to go through it, but these are the items that you do report. And over on the left side, it's the campus level. And the 6-digit, the 8-digit OPID, I think everyone's familiar with it. It's the number that it's assigned by the Department of Education to each post-secondary educational institution that's an eligible institution under the Higher Education Act. 6 digits is the institution. The last two, the suffix, is location. But we require it we call it campus level, and that's 8 digits. It may be 00, which is the main campus, or maybe the only campus, but we want all 8 digits. The rest of it, you can see the information we need, and it shouldn't be any surprises. It's identifying information, and then information about the student's enrollment, full-time, three-quarter time, and so on, effective dates, and the program indicator. The center column there is specifically on the program reporting, and again, I mentioned zip code, credential level, length of program, and some special indicators for some of these special kinds of programs. Way over on the right, the way this is set up, there's 3 types of records: campus level, program level, and then we have a one field record of a student's email address, which is not required, but it's very helpful. Okay? All right. I think, next slide. So as was mentioned earlier, we do find some problems where schools are not reporting the information completely because of some confusing things. One of them is these visiting or transient students, whatever you call them at your institution. We believe, and in discussions with other folks, that we should designate, or you all designate, you may not use these terms, there's the home school. That's the school where the student is enrolled for the purposes of receiving a degree or other credential. And then there's the host school, where they are not, or generally are not, or should not be enrolled for purposes of receiving a credential. When that's done properly, only the home school should report, and they should use the information from the host school to talk about enrollment and what program the student is in. The host school, since that student is not a regular student enrolled for purposes of receiving a degree or credential at the host school, should not report that student at all. And we found situations where these host schools were reporting the student in the campus level, not in the program level because they weren't enrolled in a program at that school, and then we're coming across our nasty letters because they didn't have enough students with program information. So be careful about that. Okay? You can take another look at that slide. I know I went through it quickly. Okay, we've mentioned and danced around, and we didn't mean to be cute about this, about compliance, but as we did mention, this requirement was effective almost 4 years ago, 3 years ago, from October of 2014. And we worked really hard and had we've had webinars and training and handbooks and our conferences and other conferences around, including at some ACRO and regional ACRO conferences. And we have very, very good compliance, but we need as close to perfection as we can get. So what we did is establish a process of escalating notifications that we will send to the schools. We set so far an arbitrary limit of 90% or greater is what we expect because of the couple of exceptions I mentioned. But if the percentage of students being reported without program information falls below 90%, we are concerned, and we sent a letter. We sent the first letters on April 27th to about 800 to 900 schools, and reminding them of this. There's a provision in the letter that says read all these materials. If you think that you're being 85% or 75%, whatever, and not hitting the 90 is legitimate because of the nature of your population, send us an email. We'll talk to you, and we can make an adjustment. If we don't make an adjustment and you're still below 90%, the next letter, or the first letter, went to the financial aid administrator and the enrollment reporting contact person, if we had one, and Randy will explain that in just a second. The second letter, if it's still below, will go to those same two people, but this time with a CC to your institutional CEO, president, chancellor, whatever.
What time between letters?
We're expecting to, we want to look at the data that comes in, and we expect it'll be probably between 2 and 3 months after we send out the first letter. May go a little bit longer, because we know it takes time to clean things up, especially if you have systemic problems, or you just have to kind of digest everything that we've talked about today and so on. They won't be like the next month you better be up to speed. Thanks.
It's actually 4 months right now.
We're looking at 4 months for the second letter.
From the first to the second.
Right. But the danger there, and I'm glad, thanks Randy, is don't let that slide into, well, I'll get to it later, because later is going to be here, particularly if you need to make some changes with the way your systems are handling these kinds of students or your policies. As I said, the second letter will have a CC to your CEO. Unfortunately, if we have any still out of compliance, there will be a third letter, and that one will go to the institution's CEO, telling that person that we've notified your people at least twice, and your school is still out of compliance, and we, Federal Student Aid, will be referring your institution to our program compliance area for possible consideration of sanctions against your institution. And that's hard. I get it. We understand it. It took us a lot to kind of cross that bridge to decide we had to do that. But as I said, it's over 3 years we have to do that. And hopefully we'll send, not silly enough to think we won't send any of those third letters, but I hope we're down to just a couple of dozen and we can work with those schools. Okay, Randy is going to explain the enrollment reporting contact and then some other data that screens that are available for you to take a look at in NSLDS.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. This screen shows where you can provide us with an enrollment reporting contact. This is on the NSLDS website for financial aid professionals. We ask you to give us the most appropriate person to handle enrollment reporting issues at your school. We note that this can't be the third-party servicer. It has to be somebody from the school. You can give address and phone number, but the key thing we need is a valid email address. And we would also request that you keep this up to date if there's any turnover. Next slide. So some of you may not be familiar with the NSLDS website or have access to it. So this slide shows how you can get access to the NSLDS website. And we do strongly encourage you to have somebody in your office have access to this site, so you can see all this information that we're talking about that's on the website. To get access, you would go to your primary destination point administrator, and if you don't know who that is, check with the financial aid office. It's probably somebody there, and they will set you up with access to the NSLDS website. And if you can't find out who it is, you can call the CPS SAIG technical support desk at the number listed there. The compliance notifications Jeff was just talking about, if you've received one, you can see a history of any letters you've received on the enrollment statistics page. And this can be accessed through the enrollment reporting profile on the website under the enrollment reporting statistics page. And it shows the key data that was on the letter, when it was sent, what letter it was, what your percentage it was based on. It also shows your error percent rate. And there's a little button there that says View Letter. You can actually click that button and an image of the actual email that you received will pop up so you can see what it says if you don't have the email. Next slide. This slide shows the enrollment reporting statistics page. The letters, the 90% threshold Jeff was talking about, it's all based on the enrollment reporting statistics. NSLDS calculates this every month. And what we do to calculate the percentages, the cohort of students we're looking at are students that were on your roster that were associated to your school 135 days prior to the evaluation date, the date we're looking at it. And the reason we did this is for, as new students come onto the roster, we wanted to give you plenty of time to report them with enrollment and with program enrollment information. For schools that are just looking at this now and having some issues with older students on the roster and whatnot, as we've noted, it'll take a few months to clear these off, but as you start addressing these issues, your statistics will improve in the months going forward. And that's also a reason we're spacing these warning notification letters farther apart to allow you time to react and update. And at the back of this presentation, there's several slides of references that reference there's actual links, hyperlinks to the various newsletters and electronic announcements we've sent out. This was introduced in newsletter 49 in July 2015, so you can take a look at that. The next two slides just have, I'm not going to go over these in detail. They have definitions of the columns on the enrollment reporting statistics page. You can take a look at these. And I'll put in my first plug for the enrollment reporting guide in it. There's a large document. There's also a link to that in the back that goes into quite a bit of detail about everything we're talking about here. And now I'm going to hand it over to George again for some information about issues and actions that you can take.
All right, thanks, Randy. We have, at the Clearinghouse, have been working closely with FSA, working and to identify schools that have scores below 90% and the reasons why that's happening. And so I've been working with a lot of schools to look at the students that are appearing on the roster, what's impacting the score, and how we can share some information with you that would be helpful. So the first issue are just students not being reported with program information. So I would encourage you all to look at the students that you're reporting and the information that's in your student information systems and make sure that you've coded students properly with program information, as Jeff was talking about earlier. We're also seeing issues related to students that have been flagged as an error by the NSLDS in the enrollment roster file that we've submitted. And so if a student is flagged with an error, that student's record is not being loaded into the NSLDS. So if they have program information and there's something about their record that's causing an error, then that program information is not being included in the calculation that NSLDS does. So you need to make sure that you're reviewing those errors and that you're making corrections to the information as quickly as possible. There's also issues with, we've seen students that appear in the NSLDS as having program information, or the NSLDS is expecting program information, and the institution is either not reporting that student or they're not reporting that student in a program. So I would encourage you to look at issues like that. In the NSLDS, there are reports where you can retrieve lists of students that they're expecting to be in a program and they're not being reported in a program. Sometimes a student changes their mind, and when they were applying for financial aid, they thought they were going to be in one program, and they've changed their mind and they're going to pursue something else. So make sure you're looking at those students. So other issues, pretty common. I think a lot of folks have cleaned this up, but the undeclared, undecided majors, Jeff spoke about that earlier, and there is a zip code in the zip code directory, 24.0102, that is the general studies zip code. If a student is seeking a degree but has not declared their major yet, that would be the zip code that you would use according to the directory. The next issue is just student behavior. These are students that attend your institution. They are not seeking a degree. but they maybe are seeking a degree at another institution, and that might be the institution that they received financial aid at. So this happens a lot of times during the summer, where you've got students who come back home and they just want to take some courses at the local community college, or maybe they're taking courses at a local community college for cost or convenience purposes. And so you're reporting them their enrollment, but they're not seeking a degree at your institution. So be careful about those students. If you have a lot of them and they're negatively impacting your score, I believe the guidance from FSA is to contact the NSLDS, and there are waivers and customized scores, thresholds that are available.
Right, George. If you received a letter, in the letter there's an email address that you can send an email to, and that will initiate that process.
Okay, and
yeah,
and in the sake of time here, Jeff spoke a lot about consortium agreements already, so I'll skip that issue. And so the last thing that we're seeing a lot of are students that are appearing on NSLDS rosters that are very old student records. They maybe attended an institution years ago prior to the reporting requirements of program information. I'm going to encourage schools, if you're having issues like that, if you're feeling that there are students on your enrollment roster from the NSLDS that are really old records, we've identified some scenarios where institutions are running queries in their student information system. They're extracting a list of students. Most of the time, these are students that are in an admitted status, and then they're uploading that list, those lists into processes that Jeff described earlier back on slide 17 for transfer student monitoring or financial aid histories, and they're uploading those lists into the NSLDS for those purposes. And if you're doing that, that will trigger the NSLDS to add that student to your next enrollment roster. Every instance that I have seen of old students appearing on rosters have been the result of queries being run or financial aid history lookups being done into the NSLDS and causing students to appear like that. So if you are using queries in your student information system, I would look at them, look at the results, make sure that those students are the students that you want to be submitting. I think there are some date parameters on the admitted status that you might want to be looking at. I've worked with a couple institutions that found that they were identifying students that they admitted more than 10 years ago, and they were still uploading them into the NSLDS for transfer student monitoring. So that's going to cause issues for you and negatively impact your score.
Okay. Next to skip to. Okay, we're running short on time, so I'm going to go pretty fast here. So there's a couple slides here on ways you can improve your enrollment reporting. George already covered some of this, but the first and most obvious thing is to certify all the students that are on your roster and report program data for all students that are in a program based on the definitions we've given you. Because these the old students or the students that are incorrectly getting on your roster or inadvertently getting on your roster will lower your statistic and can cause you to drop below 90%. Correcting all your errors in a timely manner will help. And next slide, please. I've seen some questions going by in the chat about some of this, but there are tools on the website, and we've covered them in some recent communications, newsletters, and whatnot. You can search on the website on enrollment update for students that are still in a W or G status that have just been hanging out there for years in some cases. You want to certify those a second time to get them off the roster. You can also search for students that do not have program data, certified program data, and add those as appropriate, add program data for them. And you can also search for students that haven't been certified in over 60 days. We also have a late certifications report available on the reports tab of the website where you can find older students. As far as the online tools, Newsletter 55, we published last August, introduced those and talks about them. And you can look over some of the other newsletters on there, particularly the ones from the last year have a lot of information about new tools we've added. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Bill. Yeah, so thanks, Randy, and really thanks, Jeff and George. As Randy mentioned, there are all kinds of reference materials that people can go and see directly on the presentation. Like all of our webinars, this presentation will be archived and will be found on our site, acro.org, in about 20 minutes, and it's also recorded, so everybody will be able to go back at their own leisure. In the meantime, we have had folks who have been kind of synthesizing all of the questions, and there's been a lot of questions, so we're trying to group them in just some really good areas, and so that we're just going to go through these questions and see what we can come up with. So the first one is from Robert Clark, and he asked, both home and host have the option of dispersing aid in a consortium. Wouldn't the dispersing school need to report the enrollment for the student?
This is Jeff. No, it's the school in which the student is enrolled for purposes of receiving the degree or other credential from the institution. We do provide under our consortium the flexibility of either school to pay, but it's the school that for enrollment report is the home school, not the host school. If the host school reports, that's where you run into trouble because they're not enrolled in a program at the host school. So it's the home school only.
Thanks, Jeff. The next question is from Emily. All of our NSLDS errors are students from about 20 years ago. What's going on there?
This is Randy. Yeah, George kind of addressed this a minute ago. We've researched a few of these, and we have found that in some cases they are students that have gotten onto transfer student monitoring or financial aid history requests, and in some cases the school may not be aware that's happening. It could be happening in their software. We've also seen some that they're old W withdrawn or G graduated statuses that were only certified once and are still hanging out there. So if you look into this and you believe that not to be the case, please contact us and we can research other specific examples. But the ones we've seen are because of that so far.
But Randy, let me ask, if they really did graduate, they should report them as graduated again.
Yeah.
Or withdrawn again, and that will get them off the
roster. The second certification should drop them off.
Get them off the roster. And if they never heard of the student, there's a code for that, X or Z or something.
Yes.
And that will get them off the roster as well.
Z is never heard of them. X is they never attended, like if they applied but never attended, perhaps.
And that's the kind of cleanup you have to do because, as the lady asked, we never were requiring program information, so it's going to dramatically lower your percentage when you really don't have a problem because those people haven't been around for years.
Okay, the next question is from Michelle. She asks, we have students that take a course at the college as non-degree students. Do we need to report these students?
They should be reported at the campus level because it kind of, again, my words, protects them for if they got loans at your school or at another school. But by definition, they're just taking a course. They're not enrolled in a program at your school, so do not report program information. That's why we have the 90% threshold, because there will be some of these cases probably at many schools. That's also why we have these contact us if you're a school for whatever, like a community college that may have more than 10 or 15%. These situations, we can adjust the threshold, but you report them at the campus level, but not without any program information.
So Joan asks, we have always assumed enrollment through summer after spring. I know of a school who was recently flagged by the feds because they failed to report at the end of spring that the student was not enrolled summer or fall. Can you address this?
Well, it's hard to get a specific case. The or fall would be a problem. If the student was enrolled in the spring and not enrolled in the summer, it's true, we have longstanding what we call a summer bridge. You would continue to report the student with this status at the end of spring. But then if the student failed to show up in the fall, then you're supposed to go back and show that student as withdrawn or graduated back to the spring. That could have been the issue. And when it says flagged by the feds. I don't know whether that's in program review or there was a federal audit or whatever. It's hard to tell in detail. But the way this is written, was not enrolled summer or fall. I believe that that correctly is a problem that should have been fixed.
Okay. Melody asks, does enrollment status effective date need to be the same as the term begin date? This is a common error for us, but the dates are correct. Why is this an error and how do we fix it?
This is Randy. We don't think we have any term date edits such as this. I don't know, George, do you possibly have a term date edit? We'd need to know what the...
Yeah, I think that if they're having specific issues with a data file that they're sending to the clearinghouse, they should talk to their analyst about it. I'm not going to...
But I will note real quickly, because I saw a question in the chat, in the Q&A chat about effective date. With the terminal statuses, if you report a G twice or W twice, it has to be with the same effective date. If you update the effective date, and we've seen this in the past too, it will not drop off. You've got to report it twice with the same effective date of the G or W status.
And just Jeff, one more thing, and can't tell from the question, but the effective date is the effective date of that enrollment status. So, for example, if the student was full-time when you reported in for a fall semester, let's say on August 25th, you reported the effective date of that, this is the freshman entering, and then when you did a reporting, of course you did it every 2 months, but at some point there's one in early spring, and that student is still full-time, the effective date is not January, it's the prior August. It's the original start of the effective date of that status.
Right.
As long as they can remain in that status.
As soon as they go out of that status, a new effective date, they may come back, then it's a new effective date.
Right, and Melody's question, I can think of lots of scenarios where the enrollment status effective date would not always be the term begin date.
Right.
So
right.
That's why I would say that if it's a clearinghouse question, then I'd have her work with her analyst there at the clearinghouse.
Right. We put out an electronic announcement in April that goes into great detail about effective dates, certification dates, and reporting dates. It's not listed in the references in this presentation because it wasn't directly related. But if you go on the IFAP website, you'll be able to find that under electronic announcements from April.
Okay.
Vivek asks, are we required to provide the program level data only for Title IX programs or for any and all?
Title IV programs.
Sorry.
The answer is all. And very quickly, it's, again, we want to protect the student. So even if they're not in a Title IV eligible program, but they have loans, we'll keep them in an enrolled status, keep them on a repayment for a little bit longer.
Jackie asks, where do we make the error corrections? On the NSC website or NSLDS?
Well, if they're talking about a school that participates with the clearinghouse, if you're talking about your enrollment roster errors from the NSLDS, we send you, the clearinghouse would send you an email with a link to the page that you would go to work those on our site and send us the updated information. If you're a clearinghouse school, we request that you provide us that information so that we can put that information on your roster response to the NSLDS. If you go online with the NSLDS and you put information in there that we don't have, then we're out of sync, and there's a possibility that we would respond to a future roster and we would write over top of what you put into the NSLDS. So,
and for schools that don't use a clearinghouse or another service, so you would do the corrections a couple of ways. One is using our corrections, the error report that came out, and resubmit that, which would work if you did it in time. But you also could go online and fix it, but you have the same possibility if someone in your office goes online and fixes, Mary's record where the error was, and then you don't do anything in the system that created the wrong reporting, a month ago, it's going to overlay it. So like any correction process, this is nothing special here. You can do it online, but you got to make sure your system doesn't overlay it.
So Kathy has another question about which students to report. Do we report international students enrolled in a program but do not receive U.S. federal aid?
Well, we got to be careful that they never receive federal student aid. They're not going to receive, be careful of that. It wouldn't hurt if you did report them, but they're unlikely to be on your roster. unless another school or the student themselves for some reason went in and put them on a roster, in which case report them. But you shouldn't have to go out of your way to include these people.
Becky asks, can we just report the current and active program a student is in, or do we have to report all previous programs as well?
Well, it should have been from 3 years ago, right? So we would be 3 years into that. I think right now we're just saying, let's get this going, get the program the students in. If you're doing, if you're going to rush right off and tomorrow, do a roster properly, if it's whatever your schedule is, or working with the clearinghouse, the program the student is in. I know we're at the end of June here, middle of June, so it's the program. If you're doing a roster the next month or so, it would be the program they were in let's say spring. If you're a semester-based, if you're a semester program, no, you're not. You don't have to go back. But I do have to say there are students whose participation in the loan programs and perhaps in this 150% limitation, which I mentioned, which you can talk to your financial aid administrator, might not be treated properly if the school had not done this going in the past semesters, because we keep track of that. So right now, we just want everybody to be up to speed currently. But this is the problem why we maybe waited too long and we're too patient before we came down hard like we've done.
So Sarah asked, is there any way to self-check our compliance before we get the second or even the third notification?
Yes, on the NSLDS website, the enrollment reporting statistics page that we talked about and showed a couple of slides of, and is in newsletter 55 or 49, I guess. You can go out there each month. We calculate the statistics on the third Wednesday of each month, and they are available at that time, and you can see what your percentage is. It shows the most recent 12 months of statistics.
So Patrick asked, can a non-degree student receive a deferment?
Oh, deferment from loans, yes. This is this flexibility we provide. That a student, now you can't receive federal student aid if you're not in a program leading to a degree or certificate, but if a student got a loan at your school someplace else and now they're in a non-degree and enrolled at least half time, we give them a break and not have them have to enter repayment. So the answer is yes. And that's handled simply by you reporting the student as being enrolled, whatever the enrollment is, but at least half time, and then we will make sure that our servicers keep the student in in-school status or give them an in-school deferment.
John asks, how do we change the PPL from months to years?
If you change the length, this is Randy, if you change the length of a program that's reported, that creates a new unique program because the program is defined by the zip code, the credential level, and the program length at a particular location, school location. So you should report it the correct length in years and then report the other program with the incorrect length in months with an X status that they technically never attended that program because we're trying to get rid of it. But you need to make the effective date of that X status go back to the beginning, of their enrollment there. So it'll wipe it out.
And I'm assuming, maybe I shouldn't, the school recognized that they reported it with the wrong metric, months instead of years.
Yeah, we've talked about this in other communications. If it's a 4-year program or 2-year program, we really want you to report that as 4 years or 2 years with a measurement of years. If you give us 24 months or 48 months, we're going to convert that, and it's going to come out 48 months is going to come out to over 6 years in most cases because we convert it with a formula that includes the weeks in Title IV academic year, and most schools are giving us 32 weeks or maybe 40 weeks. So it blows up the length in years when you do that.
Laurel asks, how does the host school not report the non-program or transient student or get them off their roster?
Well, whatever system you're using to go from your registration system to complete an NSLDS roster or to do something with the clearinghouse has to make sure that transient students who are not your students are not reported, do not end up in NSLDS. So if you're doing it yourself, then you have to have a little procedure in your software that only includes people who are your students. I don't know if the clearinghouse can make that distinction if the enrollment roster from the school just shows these 3 people and they're all registered full-time, but one of them really is a transient student, you wouldn't know to help them out on that.
Yeah, we don't know that.
So I think clearinghouse schools, you need to talk to clearinghouse about how to not include those people, or maybe something you have to prep as you prep the file before you send it to the clearinghouse, as well as prepping the file before it goes to us, to not include those students.
Yeah, if a student is reported to us, we just assume that it's reported with all of the information the way the school wants us to report it out. So there's no indicator to us to tell us that.
The flip side of that is that if you're the home school and I don't know how the registrar systems work, and you don't have the student being enrolled in, let's say, the spring 2017 semester because they're at another school, they're still your student, and you're obligated to know about their enrollment at that other school, whether they're full-time, three-quarter time enrolled, and it's the program at your school. So, this is not just an easy transfer of your regular registration system data into NSLDS or to the clearinghouse into NSLDS. There's special, we try to avoid too many of these exceptions, but there's certain definitions that only apply for this enrollment reporting.
So Jennifer asks, makes a statement of saying, I think that it's a school that creates the SSCR schedule, even schools that use the clearinghouse, right?
So schools create a schedule of when they are going to report to the clearinghouse based upon the dates of the term, the census date, and things like that. That's your schedule that a school would create to report to the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse has a mechanism with the NSLDS to create a schedule of when the SSCR or enrollment roster from the NSLDS will be created and sent to the clearinghouse for processing. We request schools not to go in and modify that schedule in the NSLDS. That could throw you out of compliance. So you do create a schedule with us. It is for your enrollment reporting to the clearinghouse.
So just to let everybody know, we are going to continue to answer some of these questions. So I know that it is 3 o'clock, so we got a couple more. We're going to try to go for a couple more minutes and see how many more questions we can answer. So Catherine asks, when we report to the clearinghouse, they require the CIPP code, or we get errors. Are you saying that we should only report the campus level of the non-degree students? How do we resolve this?
In the clearinghouse process, if you've got a student that you're reporting and there's an indicator that the student is degree seeking or not, if you populate that with a Y, meaning yes, they are in a program, a degree-seeking program, you have to populate the zip code field. If they're not in a degree-seeking program, you populate that field with an N, and then you're not obligated to populate the zip code field.
So this is Jeff. So I think that if she's running into this problem, they're not getting those flags set properly, because you would not edit if it.
Well, we wouldn't be looking for that zip code if it was N.
The other thing, while we easily and conveniently use degree and degree seeking, for our purposes, it's a credential awarded by the institution. So let's make sure that a student most schools offer some kind of a certificate or other kind of credential below a degree, they get treated just like degrees. So don't, how I say this without too many negatives, don't not report program level because the student is in a certificate program because they're not in a degree program. Everyone takes shortcuts, and it's fine by saying degree and non-degree. It's a credential awarded by the institution.
Okay, from Linda, George, is there a way we can report transient students during the summer so that they can use the other NSC services such as enrollment verification, flag them so that NSC doesn't report them to NSLDS?
I would say at this time there is not. Any student that is reported to us as enrolled, we're going to set them up to be reported out. But I can take that offline. I think that I can reach out to this person and have that conversation, but we do have a mechanism for information to be reported to us that does not fall into compliance reporting. But I don't want to confuse the rest of the folks on the call with how to report something if it's not going to be used for compliance reporting. So I'll reach out to Linda and resolve that.
And just so everybody knows, we're only taking a couple of questions at a really high level, but we got many more questions, obviously, that folks have submitted. And what we'll do is we will take all of these questions and look to have each of these questions answered, and everybody will have access to all this entire section of the Q&A. So we're just taking some of the ones at a very high level that will impact lots of institutions. So the next question is from Roger. What if you have a site where many of the students reported are taking dual degree, dual credit high school courses that are not degree seeking?
This would be like the international students. There's no requirement you report them because these are high school students. I can't think of a reason why they would have had received federal student aid before and certainly can't receive it now. So you really shouldn't report them, and you should find a way not to report them because we're kind of limited. We're under the statute. We're only supposed to collect information about people who participate in the federal student aid programs, and so it's to report somebody who's not even close to that because they're still a high school student would not be compliant. So again, this is where, depending on how the college registered these people and if there are any special flags within the institution's registration system, you need to figure out a way not to report them to NSLDS either directly or through a third party.
Okay, Brenda asks, when a student who is enrolled in attends modules 1 and 3 in a payment period, but is not in attendance in module 2, all right, everybody got that so far? Should the school report the LDA as of the end of Module A, or if the student has confirmed attendance in the future module, meaning 3, should the school refrain from reporting a LDA?
So you've got a situation where the student was in Module 1 and is either enrolled or maybe completed it, not in 2, and as luck would have it, during 2 is when your schedule comes up to complete a roster. But they're planning on coming back in Module 3, but who the heck knows if she's going to come back. That is an enrolled student. The whole semester or term is considered to be enrolled until you know otherwise. So, it's not perfect, but it's certainly safer than withdrawing them and having bad things start to happen. Then they simply come back, and if the 2-month sequence could get them beyond getting any protection. So no, those students should be reported as with the enrollment status. And you didn't ask it here, but the enrollment status for the entire modules, like if it was 6 credits in the first module and 6 credits in the second, that's 12, that's full time.
Okay, Stephanie asks, when we have been using the exclude student with certified programs to make sure we do not miss anyone, but our percentage is not going up,
Okay, yeah, this is Randy. This relates to the way we calculate the statistics and the 135-day look back. When you go onto the website and check the exclude students with programs, that shows you what's happening out there today. But the percentage is going to be based on who was on your roster 135 days ago. So if you had some of these, old W and G students, or students that you have dropped from the roster, but you never reported program information on them, they are going to count against the statistic for a couple months. So when you're on the website, you're only looking at what's out there as of today. But if you clean up this reporting and the program reporting, it'll work out going forward, and your statistic will go up in a couple of months.
Okay, we got a couple more. Anne Marie asked, when reporting withdrawals or retroactive withdrawals, we report the effective date as the withdrawal date. Should we be using the date of termination?
Yeah, this is Randy again. This gets to effective dates. We mentioned, I think maybe Jeff mentioned too, we did an electronic announcement about how to properly use effective dates and withdrawal dates. And we did this in part in response to some input from schools who were being dinged by auditors over late reporting. If you report a correct effective date, and it's retroactive and it's in the past, it's not out of compliance. We want you to give us the correct effective date. And if that date is more than 60 days in the past at the time you report it, that's fine with us. Now, we know some auditors were kind of somehow interpreting the 60-day, every 60-day reporting that the effective date had to be within 60 days. That is not true. So look at that electronic announcement from April.
I want to say one thing. Yeah, we got one last one. And the final question is, Thomas asked, how accurate must the ACD be?
Anticipated completion date?
Yep.
It's as accurate as you can tell. I mean, you can't, for many programs, you don't know. Students don't always behave like we think. That's a protection date of, in case some reporting gets messed up. So as accurate as you can with your interpretation of, the length of the program the student is in, how far along they are, and so on. But I wouldn't worry about every student. You have to count days and see if they completed, 15 credits this semester. Oh no, they're going to go on another month. I wouldn't worry about that.
So with that, we're going to close off the webinar. Just a couple final words. Just really want to thank Jeff, Randy, and George, all the folks that are here from Department of Education. We have a whole cadre of folks that are here. Really want to thank them. Want to thank George and his team who are also here. Obviously, this is a very important issue for everybody involved, and it's reflective in the fact that we had 554 folks on the line. So we want to make sure that you guys have all this information. You guys are able to be in compliance. I know that folks from Department of Education really want everybody to be in compliance, and that's why we worked very collaboratively in this presentation. Again, this webinar will be made available through the ACRO webpage. I know that the National Student Clearinghouse would also have a copy of it all. The audio will be available to everybody as well, and as I mentioned, everybody will have access to all the questions, and we will work with the Department of Ed and different folks to make sure that every question is answered, and that way, as well as now you have everybody's contact information and where you can get additional resources in order to be in compliance. Again, want to thank everybody for taking time out of their afternoon to be part of this. And again, thank you to the Department of Education, the National Student Clearinghouse, and Jeff, Randy, and George. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.